So I actually recorded a totally different video to post this week. And then some things happened in US politics and news. Now, this is not a political channel. I'm not going to give you feedback on the inaugural address or things like that. But a topic has come up in political discourse and in cultural discourse that actually is really relevant to sonnets. And so I want to talk today about sonnets and immigration. Now, what do sonnets have to do with immigration, you might ask? Well, you might remember from a few videos ago, a woman named Emma Lazarus. Now, Emma Lazarus was born in 1849 and she died in 1887. She was in that aftermath of the American Renaissance generation that we've talked about before. And probably the most famous sonnet in American history was written by her, and it's about immigration. So I want to revisit that sonnet and kind of talk about my own interaction with that sonnet and maybe help us think a little bit more about this topic that's in the air that poetry has interacted with so memorably in American history. So Emma Lazarus was a New Yorker. She was from a Portuguese family. But one of the things that was unique about her is she was Jewish. And she wasn't just ethnically Jewish with no connection to her religion. Her family were practicing Orthodox Jews. And Emma Lazarus kind of came of age as a writer during the Civil War. She was a teenager during the Civil War years. And she began writing poetry in response to the death, destruction, suffering that she saw in the Civil War. And she also around this time discovered the poetry of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And it was Emerson who inspired her to write not only about things that she cared about, write about things from an American perspective, but particularly try and articulate, like, what is it that's special about America in American poetry? We might even say there are formal American qualities to poetry beyond just American topics. And it's something that she was very interested in. She ended up meeting Emerson and was actually friends with both Emerson and his wife and got a lot of feedback and encouragement from Emerson. She ran into Thoreau and others. And so she became a writer of this kind of post-Civil War generation that was dealing with a reconstructing America. But one of the things that became particularly dear to Lazarus in her career wasn't necessarily the plight of the reconstruction of the South, though that was a big topic, but being in New York, immigration became really important to her. And it was particularly personal to her because a lot of the immigration that was taking place in New York, especially in the late 1870s and early 1880s, was Jewish immigration. Now, this isn't the kind of immigration that we often talk about where, you know, someone is like, hey, I could get a better job in America, you know, I'll go over there and, you know, see what I can do. These were refugees. In 1879 and 1880 in particular, the Russian government, the Romanian government, the German government, and several other governments in Central and Eastern Europe began these very virulent anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish campaigns where it wasn't just, oh, you know, you're a second-class citizen, but basically round them up and get them out. And so you have hundreds of thousands of Jewish people from the European continent who are coming to America, not just looking for a better job, but looking for a place to survive. And Emma Lazarus hears about these people and ends up going and spending time with immigrant and refugee communities of Jews who have recently come to America. Around the same time, you have an interest by French writers and French activists and ultimately French artists to pay tribute to America. You know, it's been a while since America and France teamed up to fight the British back in the Revolutionary War. And there's a French anti-slavery activist in particular, who decides, what we should do is we should donate an emblematic statue to America. Now, he has this idea back in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War. And it takes about a decade and a half to really get things going. He finds a sculptor who's going to sculpt this Statue of Liberty, Lady Liberty. And they make a deal with America, and New York in particular, that the French are going to raise money for the statue and cast the statue, and then they're going to send it over to America, and America is going to raise funds for the pedestal of the statue. We don't often think about pedestals as important, but this is a gigantic statue. It needs a secure place to rest. And so it'll basically be like, we'll donate the more expensive thing, we Frenchmen who care about liberty and, American ideals, but you gotta pitch in something. And so in New York in the 1880s, early 1880s, as all these Jewish immigrants are coming in, you have these kind of two big political voices in New York. You have the political voices that are saying, hey, we got to cooperate with the French. We got to raise money for this pedestal. And this is going to be America really putting its money where its mouth is when it comes to saying, no, we are the land of the free. We are open to immigrants coming. We're a land of opportunity. You have this other voice, though, which becomes very vocal in the New York press, that's saying, actually, Russia is kind of right. We don't want, these ruffians who have been kicked out of other countries to come here and, create the same problems that they created over there. It's a very, very vocal anti-Semitic faction. Emma Lazarus, as a professional poet, realizes that this is a forum for her to use her formidable writing skills. And so she engages in all these back and forths in New York newspapers, basically saying, no, look, this is not who America is. We don't send people away. The Russians might send them away. The Germans might send them away. We don't send them away. And she says, and this is what starts getting people very nervous, she says, look, I'm Jewish. I'm from a family who had to flee and come to America as a land of promise. Spanish Jews have faced tremendous problems throughout the years. She even writes a play about persecution of the Jews in Europe in the Middle Ages called The Dance of Death. And, these kind of heroic martyrs who are basically, the Black Death is blamed on them and they're killed. So she's writing both poetry and newspaper articles, what we would think of as op-eds, defending the immigration of Jewish communities to America, and America as sort of a new homeland for those, in particular, Jews who are looking for a land of freedom and opportunity and a place to call home, but also for anyone who wants to come. And so the New Yorkers who are raising money for this pedestal basically say, hey, do you want to donate a poem that we can auction off at this big art exhibit to raise funds for the pedestal? And at first she's not terribly interested in it, but then it was explained to her, no, this pedestal, it's not just, we want to build something fancy. This will help with the immigration cause. And it's that argument that leads Emma Lazarus to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to write a poem. So I want to read this poem. It's familiar to you if you have read or studied much 19th century American poetry, but I'm going to read it. And then I want to talk about its impact in general. So this is the new Colossus. And this was written and published in 1883, and then it ended up in the early 1900s, I think, around the turn of the century. It was actually added in bronze on a plaque to the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. The new Colossus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Now, we've been talking about sort of this political argumentation and this fervor for welcoming immigrants that Emma Lazarus has. And it might seem a little weird now to turn to formal considerations, but I want to think about how the sonnet is a structure for these ideals and these arguments that Emma had been putting forth in other venues. So one of the things that a sonnet can often do is create a contrast, kind of say, here's an image that we're rejecting in the first half, in the octave, and then turning to here's what we're going to accept in the sestet. So in the octave, we have this rejection of the old Colossus. So if you look it up in online, the Colossus of Rhodes was this great bronze statue that had 1 foot on one side of the harbor of Rhodes and another foot on the other side. It doesn't exist anymore, but this is, in classical antiquity. So she says, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land. So we have fame and land as these first two rhyme words at the end. And then we have, here at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, mother of exile. So we have fame, land, stand, flame, name, and then, if we're clever, we'll know what's coming next. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. This is a good old ABBA rhyme scheme, the Italian rhyme scheme or the Petrarchan rhyme scheme. Emma Lazarus at this point hadn't actually traveled in Europe. It was kind of one of the last main things she did in her life in the mid 1880s. She did a tour of Europe. She met with Jewish communities there. She kind of got exposed to the art and culture and political problems of Europe. But she's already drawing on the Italian rhyme scheme here. In the third line through the eighth line, we have this kind of alternate vision, not the brazen giant of old with conquering limbs. That word conquering is important. We're not going to be the brazen conquering thing. We're going to be something else. We're going to be welcoming. And we're going to be welcoming exiles, and we will be maternal welcome, not masculine conquering. I think the masculine feminine juxtaposition is implicit, but it's there. We then turn in the sestet to what communication this woman is going to give. And I think this is actually pretty unique in the history of the sonnet. It's something at least we don't see a lot. A octave which rejects an image and describes another image, and then a sestet which is what that accepted image says. So I think it's a really interesting structure here. So she says, keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddling masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuge of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So we have a she, poor, free, shore, me, door. So it's interesting, ABBA, and then just CD, CD, CD. There's no E rhyme. She's being very economic with her rhyme words. And she really, I think, wants to tie that whole final sestet, that whole final 6 lines together with this really tight rhyme scheme. There's a new dimension, I think, to this ideas about immigration in the sestet. And it's not just, we're going to welcome people instead of conquering them. It's who are the type of people we're welcoming? Are we welcoming the brightest and the best that the world has to offer? No, that is a view of immigration that people like to talk about. But she's focusing on, no. It's the wretched refuse. It's the homeless. It's the tempest-tossed. We aren't going to be, a forum for intellectuals, that says, come brightest and best. We're going to be home. We're going to be shelter from the storm. It's hard not to quote, these American cliches from this, but it's something that she brought into our vocabulary. I mentioned this in the last time we talked about Emma Lazarus. I got a little flack, people being like, it's a little cheesy. Well, okay. But it's a really important part of discourse that's put into a masterful sonnet form. This lifting of the lamp, I think, was one of the last things I want to say. And other critics have mentioned, we have all this light imagery, from the brazen to the imprisoned lightning to the lifting the lamp. This idea of a shining out. It's like a lighthouse calling, not warning, but calling and welcoming. But I also think there may be a bit of sort of a biblical reference here to the idea of the city on the hill, a shining city for all to see, which is what the God of the Hebrews calls the nation of Israel to be. So there's this idea of America as this new city on a hill. Of course, that's going to get picked up a lot throughout American history, but she's putting it in the sonnet form. I wrote a poem in 2015 as the political debates were coming back around to immigration and getting some new ideas that struck me as not very Emma Lazarus-like. In 2015, I wrote a poem dedicated to Emma Lazarus. This poem is actually the one that's been the most republished and reposted of any poem I've ever written. It was originally published in Curator magazine. And I wanted to read it for you, not because I think it's as good as Lazarus's, but because I think it's an expression in poetry and in a sonnet of why I think her sonnet is so interesting. So this is called Lazarus. One sonnet can imbue a history with upright strength when shouted prose demands it bow to fear or riches. Emma writes though publishers refuse her name in print, though civil rights do not include her vote, though literati fear that Jewish friends will taint their reputation. Emma writes. She writes a sonnet for the statue gift and crafts a climax that the immigrant will need to hear, will recognize as mirror. You're poor, you're tired, you're huddled. These her blood knows like an heirloom. So she smiths a key to foil the forces in each age that shrink before the stranger. Lock the golden door. I don't want to say a lot about this poem. It's in blank verse. It's not a rhymed sonnet. In 2015, I was not writing in rhyme, though I write more in rhyme these days. I think it's important that we see poetry as something that can be a powerful tool in our political discourse, in our discourse about who we are as a country. Poetry sometimes gets a little sentimentalized as poetry is always this force for good. Poetry has not always been used as a force for good. Both sides in a debate can use poetry against each other. Both sides in a debate can be wrong. Both sides in a debate can use the power of poetry to advance ideas that may turn out to be disastrous or may turn out to be a light to all others of justice. In our age, in our country, Emma Lazarus's sonnet, The New Colossus, did what I think only a sonnet can do in putting into the octave sestet structure the argument for and the ideals for a particular view of immigration. And in the history of the sonnet, it's important to see that the sonnet is doing that, and that sonnet keeps ringing in our ears and hopefully prompting our own thought about politics, and maybe even our own poetry about it. Thanks.